All right, let's dive right into this explainer. When we think about ancient historical texts, we usually picture these fragmented stories, right? Or maybe legendary epics passed down through the generations. But the source material we're digging into today, it completely breaks that mold. We're unpacking the Gospel of Luke, and honestly, this ancient text reads way less like your standard run-of-the-mill biography and a lot more like a meticulously researched, highly organized, investigative dossier. It's a text that literally sets out to establish a rock-solid, concrete historical record of one of the most famous figures in all of human history. Now, what's really fascinating here is this number, 60. You might assume that all the historical accounts of Jesus' life just cover the exact same ground, hitting the exact same beats. But get this, an astonishing 60% of Luke's historical account is completely unique to its author. It's packed with rich details, specific events, and profound illustrations that you simply won't find anywhere else in the historical record. Over half of his findings are totally exclusive to his investigation. How wild is that? So to understand why this account is so remarkably unique, we're going to explore the man behind the text, look at why it's a uniquely detailed gospel, see how he sets the stage in preparing the way, dive into the Galilean ministry, and finally examine the dramatic final days in Jerusalem. All right, part 1, the man behind the text. Let's start our investigation by uncovering exactly who wrote this incredibly detailed account. So the author is Luke. The name itself is actually the Greek form Lukas, derived from the Latin lucus. But more importantly, our sources revealed that Luke was a highly educated physician and a super faithful companion to the Apostle Paul. His medical background, plus his extensive travels alongside Paul, uniquely positioned him to document these events. He wasn't just sitting behind a desk in some distant library, he was out there on the ground, gathering information in the exact land where the events actually went down. These hard facts really illustrate the sheer scope of his work. Luke likely compiled this account while Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea. The writing was completed around 56 to 58 CE, which, if you think about it, is incredibly close to the events he's describing. And just look at the timeline covered here. From 3 BCE all the way to 33 CE, he's giving us a sweeping 36-year period of history, and he is leaving absolutely no stone unturned. Now here is a truly fascinating detail. Luke actually wasn't one of the original 12 apostles. In fact, he probably wasn't even a believer until after Jesus' death. That means he wasn't a direct eyewitness to the bulk of his own narrative. Instead, he acted exactly like a modern-day investigative journalist. He used his time in Jerusalem to personally track down and interview surviving disciples, eyewitnesses, and quite possibly even Jesus' own mother, Mary. He was out there gathering first-hand testimony to build this airtight historical record. Moving on to part 2, a uniquely detailed gospel. Now that we know who he was, an educated doctor and a relentless investigator, let's see how that specific background shaped his writing. The crucial point here is understanding his target audience. Our source material shows that Matthew evidently wrote his account specifically for a Jewish audience. Mark, on the other hand, tailored his writings primarily for non-Jewish readers, particularly the Romans. But Luke? Well, Luke cast a much wider net. He wrote his gospel for all people. He basically designed this comprehensive, universally accessible account that anyone, completely regardless of their cultural background, could pick up, understand, and really appreciate. And because of this incredibly broad goal, you can really see the doctor's pen at work. Look at these distinct characteristics from our source. For starters, Luke's high level of education gave him a massive vocabulary, literally larger than the other 3 gospel writers combined. He also constantly provided precise, extra medical details about the physical condition of the sick that the others completely missed. On top of that, he records at least 6 specific miracles found nowhere else, and includes these incredibly unique, deeply human illustrations, like the famous stories of the neighborly Samaritan and the lost son. All right, part 3, preparing the way. Let's move over to the actual text itself and see how this all builds, starting with the early chapters. Looking at chapters 1 through 7, Luke meticulously organizes the very beginning of his account. He doesn't just jump straight into the action like an action movie. He ensures the background, the family lineages, and the early years are firmly established before the main ministry even gets off the ground. He gives us the vital context of John the Baptist's birth, Mary's visit to Elizabeth, and all the detailed circumstances surrounding Jesus' early life. Through this structure, he carefully maps out a strict chronological timeline. He takes us from the miraculous events surrounding those births in 3 BCE all the way forward to a rare, incredibly unique glimpse of Jesus as a 12-year-old at the temple, a detail, by the way, that only Luke provides. Then he propels us forward to the year of Jesus' baptism and his intense 40 days in the wilderness, rejecting the devil's temptations. Basically, the foundation is solidly laid. Which brings us to part 4, the Galilean ministry. With that historical foundation securely locked in, the narrative shifts right into high gear. These detailed chapter breakdowns across our source material show a massive, and I mean massive, expansion of activity. Chapters 9 through 21 represent the sprawling catalog of events across Galilee, Judea, and Perea. This section is just absolutely packed to the brim with teachings, parables, interactions with massive crowds, and dramatic miracles that Luke carefully, almost clinically, cataloged for his readers. The logical flow of Luke's account is completely undeniable here. He tracks the geographic and strategic steps of the movement with absolute precision. Step 1, the early preaching days mainly in Galilee. Step 2, the organizational milestone of selecting the 12 apostles and delivering the famous Sermon on the Mount. And step 3, the crucial turning point in chapter 9 where the later ministry shifts focus and Jesus decisively heads toward Jerusalem. Honestly, it's a masterclass in narrative structure. It's during this expansive middle section of the text that we see Luke's medical background shine the absolute brightest. As a physician, he literally can't help but pause the historical narrative to jot down specific physical afflictions. While another writer might just say someone was healed, Luke specifies a man was full of leprosy, or another had a withered hand, or points out someone suffering from dropsy. His trained eye captures the human suffering in clinical detail, making these historical accounts of healing so much more vivid. And finally, part 5, the final days in Jerusalem. The investigation culminates in the most heavily documented and intense portion of the text. This final snapshot of our source material covers just a few highly concentrated chapters, chapters 21 through 24. Yet it details the most pivotal, world-altering events of the entire historical account. The sheer density of information here really goes to show just how critical Luke considered these final days to be for his readers. Luke actually slows the pace down dramatically at this point. After zooming through decades of history in the earlier chapters, he now tracks the narrative almost hour by hour. He documents the final week of public ministry in the temple, the intimate Passover night, the betrayal, and the nighttime arrest. Then he walks us through the intense events of the next day, multiple trials, the execution, the burial, concluding with the shocking events of the third day. What you should really take away from this meticulous timeline is exactly how Luke builds the legal and historical case of these final days. He doesn't just casually mention a trial, he documents the specific sequence of trials before the Sanhedrin, before Pilate, and before Herod. He records the intense emotional agony on the Mount of Olives, the exact circumstances of the execution, and crucially, the multiple eyewitness accounts of the empty tomb and resurrection appearances to complete his dossier. He treats the whole shebang as a factual event demanding rigorous evidence. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. When we strip away our preconceptions and realize that this text isn't just some collection of ancient folklore, but rather the compiled, cross-examined findings of a highly educated, first-century medical investigator, well, how does that shift your perspective? When a physician sets out to interview survivors and document the facts for all people, it absolutely challenges us to look at this history not just as a story, but as a meticulously recorded reality. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. Catch you next time.